Hey everyone, tonight we're kicking off with a super simple topic, sleep, or more precisely, how medieval folks caught their Z's. Spoiler alert, it's way weirder than you'd expect. So before you get too comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually dig what I'm doing here, and hit me up in the comments, telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Always fun to see who's joining us from all over the globe. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. Let's dive into tonight's journey. Before electricity, TikTok, and the obsession with sleep hygiene. Medieval people had a night routine that would confuse even the biggest melatonin nerd today. It's called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle sliced up like an old medieval cookie. The routine's simple. After sundown, most people hit the sack early and fall into their first sleep. Then, about 4 hours later, they'd deliberately wake up and spend the next hour or two doing what can only be described as medieval midnight multitasking. This wasn't considered insomnia. Nope. This was just how sleep worked back then. That middle of the night vigil was seen as practical, useful, and sometimes surprisingly social. Folks used this time to pray, read religious texts, tend fires, or check on livestock because nothing messes up your ram's sleep cycle like wondering if your goat is still hanging out in the yard. And yes, it was also prime time for some medieval hanky-panky. Medieval docs and marriage guides noted that the body was well rested and the mind calm at this hour, which sounds like a polite way of saying everyone was too tired to argue. So if you ever thought you were romantic, waking up early to make coffee for your sweetheart, just know your ancestors set the bar way differently. The second sleep happened after this wakeful window and lasted until sunrise. Everyone from monks to peasants followed this night rhythm. Even writers like Chaucer casually mentioned it, meaning medieval literature also covered the art of not sleeping the right way. Weirdly, modern science now thinks segmented sleep might actually be more natural for humans. These two sleep cycles align with our biological clock when there's no artificial light. So next time you find yourself wide awake at 2 a.m., don't freak out, just whisper, "Ah, the night watch has begun," and head over to tend the symbolic hearth. It wasn't until the industrial age, with factories, gas lamps, and the growing fear of slacking off, that people started buying into the whole 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep thing. Like sleep was some kind of timed sport. In medieval times, waking up midnight wasn't failure. It was the schedule, and everyone had to follow it, whether they liked it or not. Now, let's talk beds, or more accurately, medieval bed simulations. Nowadays, we obsess over thread counts, memory foam, cooling gel, and whether the mattress feels like a cloud. In medieval Europe, beds were usually just a pile of once living stuff, now flattened under the crushing weight of bad sleep and unspoken regrets. A typical peasant bed was a straw mattress called a pallet, literally just straw or dried grass stuffed into a rough sack if they could afford one. Otherwise, it was just straw on the floor, which might be damp straw, or maybe nibbled on by cats. These pallets weren't comfy, but hey, better than nothing, which was the real alternative. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and great for insulation. It was also a 5-star hotel for bugs, lice, and sometimes field mice, making Sleeping and working out a pretty quiet affair. If it itched, you just ignored it. If it bit, you shifted a bit and hoped for the best. If a family had more cash, or at least a sturdy back they could prop. But hey, better than nothing. Right straw was cheap, plentiful, and pretty decent at trapping heat. It was also an all-you-can-live-in buffet for bugs, lice, and every now and then, a field mouse turning. Sleeping and working out into a pretty noisy affair. If you got itchy, you just ignored it. If it bit, you just shifted a bit and hoped for the best. If a family was a bit wealthier, or at least had someone with a strong back, they could lift the straw mattress onto a wooden frame. Didn't exactly revolutionize sleep, but it cut down the chance of waking up with a beetle nesting in your ear. Linen sheets, now that was a luxury. Most folks just wore the same clothes to bed that they'd worn all day. Pajamas, not a thing. Privacy, forget about it. The whole family, kids, parents, maybe even the elder folks slept together in the same space. Sometimes all piled on one straw heap, all together in one space. Sometimes on the same pile of straw. If you got too hot, well, you could always just roll into your cousin's elbow. Naturally, nobles had proper beds, big wooden frames, feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and canopies to block drafts and, hopefully, keep the lice at bay. These beds were so valuable they got passed down in wills. You didn't inherit land. You inherited Aunt Matilda's suspiciously lumpy feather bed. But for most medieval folks, beds weren't about comfort. They were about not freezing, avoiding the chickens, and maybe dreaming of a day when you could sleep somewhere that didn't creak and rustle. Nowadays, a nightcap means a warm drink, maybe some whiskey, a cozy fire, and questionable life choices. But back in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a drink at all. It was a hat, a real physical piece of cloth, often looking downright silly, designed to keep your head warm while you slept. See, medieval architecture wasn't winning any awards for insulation. Stone walls, drafty thatched roofs, and windows made from thin animal horn or oil paper zero help against the cold, and central heating that was called the dog, so keeping your head warm at night, especially since body heat escapes fastest from your scalp, was a big deal. Medieval people rocked simple nightcaps. These hats came in every shape and size, but the iconic version was long and pointy, like the hairstyle you'd expect on a witch who moonlights as a chimney sweep, usually made from wool, linen, or any warm scrap that wouldn't piss off the family goat. For men, it was practical. For women, it sometimes doubled as a shawl or headscarf, keeping modesty intact and hiding hair that hadn't seen shampoo since last Lent. But beyond warmth, the nightcap had social value. In some areas, married women had to keep their heads covered, yes, even when sleeping, and these caps could be embroidered or dyed to flaunt the family's wealth or status, because nothing screams success like going to bed with a tiny flag planted on your head. In more urban areas, nightcaps even became a symbol of "I'm off duty." If you opened your door wearing one of these, it was the polite medieval way of saying, "I'm not dressed to chat," and, yep, that cap basically meant buzz off. Of course, nightcaps usually came with nightgowns, basically long, loose robes. Picture Ebenezer Scrooge, minus the soul-crushing moral lessons. Nightwear wasn't sexy, but it was practical, itchy, and sometimes a fire hazard. Today, The idea of crashing next to a stranger is mostly reserved for overnight flights, overambitious camping trips, or weird Airbnb mix-ups. But in medieval Europe, it was totally normal and not optional. Say you were a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or just someone who gave up halfway to Norwich. You found an inn, a rare luxury, and asked for a bed. What you got was a spot on a bed that was already taken. Medieval inns worked more like human dorms than modern hotels. Don't expect privacy. If the bed had space, you shared it usually with complete strangers who might snore, mumble in their sleep, or sport suspicious boils. This wasn't considered rude. It was just efficient resource use. A single bed could hold 2, 3, even 4 guests, depending on size and social norms. In big cities, you might end up in a dorm with rows of beds and zero privacy, the snore competition, the gap, meaning you shared your bed with total strangers who might snore, talk nonsense in their sleep, or sport some seriously suspicious boils. And no, this wasn't rude. It was just efficient use of resources. A bed could fit 2, 3, even 4 guests, depending on size and social tolerance. In big cities, you might end up in a dorm with rows of beds and zero privacy, snoring contests, no judges, elbow turf wars, fierce. Sometimes men and women got separated, but not always. Some hospitals tried grouping beds by profession, so blacksmiths with blacksmiths, clergy with clergy, thieves with other thieves. But usually, first come, first served ruled the roost. While this sounds like a nightmare for today's germaphobes, back then it was an upgrade from sleeping outside with wolves, rain, and the occasional divine revelation or the temptation of the devil. Either way, you had to pay attention and maybe write it down, confess, or fast for 3 days to stay safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed visionaries worried about thieves. Plenty of travelers slept with their wallets tied to their belts or stashed under their clothes. Others slept on top of their luggage, turning their bags into pillow and alarm systems. If someone moved your bag, that usually meant you were about to wake up broke. Of course, the rich didn't have that problem. Nobles traveled with entourages and camped somewhere relatively comfy or demanded private rooms if the host cared about their roof. In the medieval world, going to sleep wasn't just pulling up the covers and dozing off. It was a spiritual ritual, a nightly gamble where your eternal soul was the stake. People didn't just sleep, they mentally prepared for the possibility of dying. So bedtime prayers became pretty popular. Forget lavender sprays or soothing podcasts. Medieval sleepers often ended the night with confessions, hymns, and soul-cleansing chants, just in case they kicked the bucket between midnight and dawn. The idea was simple. You could die anytime, from illness, fire, demons, or the most terrifying thing, dying after 30 in the year 1247. So yeah, better pray. Not because it's comforting, but because hell is a nightmare and you don't want to show up uninvited, unwashed, and with a soul in tatters. The classic was, if I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet, you're right, except it's basically a legal document written by a 7-year-old admitting they might die before morning. Many adults had entire prayer catalogs for different threats, one for when you feel guilty, one for when you suspect demons hiding in the rafters, one to ward off the plague, though it was sadly outdated. Some even prayed to specific saints known to keep an eye on sleepers, like holy bouncers guarding your soul at the club entrance. Monks Nuns and devout nobles ended their day with a final bedtime prayer ritual. After Compline, they swore silence, which wasn't hard since everyone was exhausted, starving, and a bit scared of the dark. Kids were encouraged to pray too, partly because it's good for their souls, and partly to keep them occupied instead of asking why the dog's on their bed. Parents reminded them angels were watching, which sounds sweet until you realize it wasn't guardian angels, but more like a celestial surveillance system. In short, bedtime prayers weren't about peace of mind, but damage control at the last minute. Think of it as medieval antivirus software. You hoped it worked, even if you didn't really get how. In the modern world, dreams are often seen as random nonsense stress, too much cheese, or your brain trying to sort paperwork in the dark. But in medieval times, dreams were taken seriously because they had eternal consequences. Dreams weren't just dreams, they were messages from God, saints, demons, your guardian angel, or maybe that weird relic you kissed last Sunday. Some dreams were divine revelations, others were devilish temptations. Either way, you paid attention and might write them down. Confess or fast for 3 days to be safe. Theologians, monks, and self-proclaimed seers spent ages decoding dreams. Whole books were dedicated to it. Dreaming of fire could mean hell. Water might signal purification or drowning. Dream of a goat-headed man juggling fish. Better call a priest and maybe move out. Medieval folks believed dreams mattered because your soul was still busy while you slept. Spent ages decoding dreams. Whole texts were dedicated to this. Dreaming of fire, hell might be knocking. Water could mean cleansing or drowning. If you dream about a goat-headed man juggling fish, best call a priest and maybe move out ASAP. Medieval folks believed dreams mattered because your soul was still active while you slept, meaning your dream actions could spill your hidden sins or mental weak spots. Dreaming about stealing a loaf of bread, maybe your subconscious is confessing your real-life gluttony or just hunger. But hey, confession's probably safer in case things go south. Monks and nuns often wrote down their dreams and shared them with their spiritual bosses. Some got props for having sacred visions during sleep. Others were advised to chill out a bit. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. For rich families, this wasn't common. Nobles usually didn't sleep next to livestock, though they might keep dogs on the bed not for warmth, but for style and redistributing goods. Some castles even had bedrooms just for pets because nothing says power like, of course. Dreams weren't just mystical puzzles, they also made for killer plot twists. Medieval literature is packed with dreams of knights bumping into angels, demons, or metaphorical creatures waxing poetic about virtue. Dreams were basically the medieval version of Netflix, minus the happy endings, and with way more symbolism. As expected, the church was suspicious. Not every dream was considered divine. Some were blamed on demons messing with innocent souls. If you dreamed something nasty, it meant your soul was under attack, or you just slept too close to the fireplace smoke. Nowadays, some people let their pets sleep in bed, cozy, if a bit smelly. Back in medieval times, sharing a bed with an animal wasn't a quirky personal choice. It was a heating strategy. Let's start with the basics. Medieval houses weren't exactly comfort palaces. Stone walls, no insulation, gusty drafts so fierce they probably had their own names. Central heating, meet the pig family in peasant homes. Humans and livestock often shared a room, sometimes the same bed, usually the same pile of straw. Chickens roamed free, dogs curled up at your feet, pigs snuffled quietly by the hearth, and if you were lucky, none bit you during the night. It wasn't about affection, though medieval folks did love their animals. It was survival. Animals generate body heat. They're warm, reliable, and unlike some relatives you know, they don't hog the blankets. A big dog could keep your toes from freezing off. A cow in the corner might raise the room temp by a degree or two, which in January felt like magic. Medieval houses, especially poor ones, often had one room for everything: cooking, eating, sleeping, sometimes dying. People and animals shared the space. Kids might sleep between their parents, and a chicken could double as an impromptu alarm clock. Hygiene. Let's not ask too many questions. For wealthy families, this was rare. Nobles usually didn't sleep next to livestock, although they might keep dogs on their beds, not for warmth, but for fashion and redistributing goods. Some castles even had bedrooms just for pets, because nothing screams power like a dog with its own room and title. Of course, there were downsides. Animals can be noisy. They wander off, and historically, they're not known for respecting personal space. It was the medieval humans who adapted. A kick in the face at 3 a.m. just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever shared a room in a hostel and thought, this is too much, let me introduce you to the medieval monastery dorm, where comfort died under the vow of silence. Monks didn't believe in privacy, softness, or fun. A typical dorm housed dozens of monks all sleeping in one big room, lined up like very straight sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were wooden planks, sometimes with straw mattresses if the abbot was feeling generous or it was a holiday. You slept fully clothed, not for modesty, but because fumbling with clothes in the dark at 2 a.m. for prayers was more painful than just sleeping ready to roll. The monastery uniform, robes, belts, and slippers. A dog with its own room and title. Of course, there were downsides. Animals could be noisy. They wandered, and historically, they weren't known for respecting personal space. They were just medieval folks adapting. A kick in the face at 3 a.m. just part of the bedtime routine. If you ever shared a room in a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, let us introduce you to the medieval monastery dorm, where comfort died under the vow of silence. Monks didn't buy into, and historically speaking, medieval folks weren't exactly known for respecting personal space. Nope, they just adapted. A good old kick to the face at 3 a.m. just part of the bedtime routine. If you've ever had to share a room in a youth hostel and thought, this is a bit much, let us introduce you to the medieval monastery dorm, where comfort went to die under a vow of silence. Monks seriously didn't believe in privacy, kindness, or fun. The typical dorms housed dozens of monks, all crammed into one big room, lined up like perfectly packed sardines. Beds, if you could call them that, were usually just wooden planks, maybe with a straw mattress if the abbot was feeling generous or it was a holiday. You slept fully clothed not because of modesty, but because fumbling around in the dark at 2 a.m. to pray was way more painful than just going to bed ready. The monastic uniform robes, belts, and sandals served as spiritual armor and terrible insulation. Cold layer up, hot tough luck, no pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no talking. Silence was enforced. Not suggested. Under Saint Benedict's rule, if you tossed and turned or moaned too loudly, you might be sentenced to a week of hygiene duty. Sandals, used as spiritual armor and about as good at insulation as a wet paper bag. If you're cold, just pile on the clothes. If you're hot, well, tough luck. No pillows, no privacy curtains, and absolutely no chatting allowed. Silence wasn't a suggestion. Under Saint Benedict's rule, it was a command. If you toss and moan too loud, you might get a week of hygiene duty as punishment. Snoring. That mystery remains unsolved. You can't help it. But if it causes a ruckus, God might hold you accountable, or at least your cellmates will. Lights were kept to a bare minimum. Maybe just a candle. You didn't need to see anything. You just had to lie still and stay sin-free. That was the whole point. Despite the Spartan setup, monks believed their bare-bones beds were soul training grounds for the afterlife. Get ready to journey by saying no to comfort. Every bit of fleshly luxury. Sleep isn't a pleasure. It's a chore to track and schedule like everything else. Some monks even slept sitting up just to avoid any hints of luxury, daydreaming, or circulation. Compared to that, a farmer's straw pile and some snoring pigs seem downright lavish. At least the pigs don't judge you. Let's talk about something that would freak out most modern sleepers, willingly waking at 2 a.m., not to pee or read prayers, but to pray. Big, cold, candle-lit prayers in medieval monasteries. This was just standard procedure. Monks and nuns stuck to a strict daily schedule based on canonical hours, including matins, the first service of the day, and by day, we mean the darkest part of the night, when even owls weren't sure whether to get up yet. Bells would ring often by whoever drew the short straw, and the whole bleary-eyed, robe-wearing crew would silently shuffle to the chapel. And yes, still fully dressed, because monks don't do pajamas. The only hierarchy they trusted was spiritual, inside the chapel, under flickering candlelight and echoing stone arches. They'd sing hymns, read scripture, and try their hardest not to doze off standing up, which was actually a real problem. There are records of monks being punished for nodding off during prayers, usually with extra chores or more prayers. You nod off on the mat, congrats. You're now leading the next round. Matins could last an hour or more. Some, particularly enthusiastic orders, stretched it out to 2 hours. Imagine trying to stay spiritually connected while your stomach reminds you dinner was just a bowl of lentils and a moral lesson, and your body is actively shutting down. After the service, monks would either go back to bed for round 2 or, by stricter orders, head straight to study or manual labor, because nothing screams sacred discipline like pounding wheat for 4 hours with fragmented breaks. Why so early? The idea was to sacrifice comfort and give the first, quietest part of the night to God, untouched by the temptations of daylight, warmth, or sleep cycles, a powerful symbol of devotion, or, at least, after you get past numb fingers, candle smoke, and Brother Ambrose's off-key chanting. In the modern world, sleeping alone is often seen as a luxury, a sign of independence, peace, or just control over the blanket. But in medieval times, sleeping solo was suspicious, impractical, or downright unsafe. Let's start with basics: warmth. Beds weren't exactly cozy. Stone walls and open chimneys didn't hold heat well, and central heating was still a work in progress. so people shared beds to stay warm, not for cuddles. But basic survival, kids slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes even neighbors' kids if they were visiting, like a sleepover, except nobody asked if you wanted to join. But besides warmth, there was a spiritual reason for group sleeping. Many believed the night was when demons worked overtime, alone in the dark. Your soul was vulnerable to temptation, or worse, possession. Having company created a moral buffer if something went wrong. At least, someone else was there to witness it or catch the demon first. For kids, sleeping alone at night was near impossible. Not safe. Let's start with basics warmth. Beds, not really warm. Stone walls and open chimneys don't hold heat. And central heating was still a fantasy. So, everyone shared beds to keep warm, not because of cuddles, but because basic survival, kids slept with siblings, parents, and sometimes even neighbors' kids if they were visiting, like a sleepover. Except you never got asked if you wanted to join, but beyond warmth, there was a spiritual reason for group sleeping. Many believed night was when demons worked overtime, alone in the dark. Your soul could be tempted or worse, possessed. Having others nearby created a moral buffer zone. If things went south, at least, someone could witness it or catch the demon first. For kids, being alone at night was basically unthinkable. Not just for comfort, but because demons, fairies, and wandering spirits were part of the nightly scene. Demons supposedly worked overtime at night, alone in the dark. Your soul was super easy to tempt, or worse, to get possessed. Having someone nearby created a moral buffer zone. If things went south, at least someone was there to catch the demon red-handed. For kids, being alone at night was basically unthinkable. Not just for comfort, but because demons, fairies, and wandering spirits were part of the nightly lineup. Stories warned that sleeping alone led to disaster and spiritual danger, and unlike today's bedtime stories, these didn't end with hugs. They ended with disappearances. Even married couples often shared beds with kids, servants, or random guests. People often slept with their kids, servants, or random guests. Privacy? That was just a modern fairy tale. The idea of two people having their own space on a giant bed was so bizarre it was either wasteful or downright suspicious. Even monks often bunked together for religious reasons. And if someone was assigned to sleep alone, it was usually punishment. Yep. In some medieval cases, sleeping solo was actually a penalty, because logic back then said solo sleep gave too much room for mischief. So next time you curl up with your blanket in a room that doesn't smell like goat, enjoy the silence. Back then, you probably had 2 kids, a sheepdog, and a cousin all snoring beside you. If you ever accidentally nodded off, sitting in a lecture hall, a horse carriage, or the dentist's waiting room, you probably woke with a stiff neck and deep regret. But in the Middle Ages, sleeping straight wasn't an accident. It was a lifestyle. Some medieval folks, especially the wealthy or pious, preferred propping themselves up with pillows instead of lying flat. Why? A few reasons, none of them comfy. First, there was this medical belief that lying flat was bad for digestion, lungs, and the body's fluid balance. In a world where doctors thought a sneeze could rearrange your soul, this made perfect sense. They believed sleeping upright helped avoid brain congestion, which sounds creepy but basically means don't drown in your own sleep. Second, There were spiritual concerns. Lying flat was too close to how the dead lie. You didn't want to confuse God or, worse, attract death's attention by sleeping in a funeral pose. Superstitious? Absolutely. But when your local priest doubles as the community health advisor, you pick your battles. So people mostly slept on their sides, propped with big pillows, cushions, or wooden headboards, basically the medieval equivalent of a lazy teen. Nobles sometimes bolted their beds upright to sit and digest their meat pies or fend off surprise demon attacks. Monks went even further. Under stricter rules, they might sleep sitting straight on benches or leaning against cold walls with nothing but a hood to hide the pain. It wasn't about health. It was about discipline. Get too comfy. You might dream. You might sin, and you better confess at 5 up. Needless to say, this wasn't about sleep quality. It was about virtue, discomfort, and some pretty confusing theology. Forget haunted dreams or goblins under the bed. For medieval folks, the real night monsters hid in the sheets, tiny, persistent, and utterly ignoring your prayers. Yeah, we're talking about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of medieval bedrooms, bedbugs. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly Europe's strong suit back then. Baths were rare, laundry was expensive, and soap sometimes came from questionable ingredients. Add in straw mattresses, shared blankets and pillows, and occasionally live chickens at your feet, and you've got the perfect buffet for bugs. Fleas and lice were so common, they basically doubled as roommates. Farmers dealt with them daily. Nobles, despite their satin sheets and feather beds, weren't immune either. In fact, some wealthy households even had dedicated inspectors hiding under the sheet, tiny, persistent, and completely ignoring your prayers. Of course, we're talking about fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of medieval bedrooms, bedbugs. Let's not sugarcoat it. Fleas, lice, and the unofficial mascot of medieval bedrooms, bedbugs. Let's not sugarcoat it. Hygiene wasn't exactly Europe's strong suit in the Middle Ages. Baths were rare, laundry costly, and soap sometimes made from sketchy ingredients. Add straw mattresses, shared bedding, and the occasional live chicken underfoot, and you've got the perfect setup for an all-you-can-eat insect buffet. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically roommates. Farmers dealt with them daily. Nobles, even with their satin sheets and feather beds, weren't exempt. In fact, some wealthy households had professional pickers. Fleas and lice were so common they were basically roommates. Farmers dealt with them daily. Nobles, even with their satin sheets and feather beds, weren't exempt. In fact, some wealthy households had professional pickers, servants whose actual job was to pick lice off their master's hair and clothes. Imagine that job title, Your Majesty. Meanwhile, bedbugs were the silent killers of medieval sleep. They hid in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, even cracks in stone walls, then popped out at night to feast like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval folks wore nightcaps and full clothes to bed, it wasn't always about warmth. Sometimes it was bug armor. The solutions ranged from mild, hiding in wooden bed frames, mattress seams, and even cracks in stone walls, then sneaking out at night to snack like tiny vampires. If you ever wondered why medieval folks wore nightcaps and full clothes to bed, it wasn't always just to keep warm. Sometimes it was about staying warm. Other times, armor against bugs. Solutions ranged from meh to hardcore. Some families burned strong-smelling herbs like mugwort or tansy to keep the creepy crawlies away. Others slept with garlic, onions, or even ashes on their beds, not exactly pest control. But hey, it killed the romance. It wasn't just physical discomfort. Fleas were seen as symbols of sin or moral filth, a harsh reminder of humanity's downfall and a terrible bed choice. So yeah, fleas got a whole lot of poetic love back then. Because, spoiler alert, it really was. We all have sleepless nights, but have you ever tried sleeping while wearing 100 pounds of iron? Didn't think so. In medieval times, some folks did just that, because apparently nothing says sweet dreams like prepping for a joust while you sleep. To be clear, most people, knights included, didn't regularly sleep in full armor. It's hot, heavy, and noisy. Trying to roll over in a suit of iron is like trying to sleep in a bag full of knives. But during war, or in hostile territory, sleeping with some armor on was considered the safer bet. Comfortable optional, survival highly recommended. A campaign night might just involve ditching the helmet and gloves, but keeping your shirt or breastplate on, just in case the enemy decides to throw a surprise midnight party. Nothing beats waking up to hooves outside and having to gear up while still half dreaming about turnips. In besieged castles, armed soldiers might even sleep with swords or axes nearby, like a very hardcore security blanket. Shields could double as pillows, and if the enemy breaks through the walls, hey, at least you're not still getting dressed. Priorities? People. Of course, sleeping in armor isn't exactly a spa day. Iron doesn't breathe, and chainmail tends to chafe the skin. Add in cold stone floors, minimalist bedding, snoring buddies, and flickering torches, and you've got a sleep setup that ranks just above airport terminals for comfort. Even non-combatants sometimes wore light armor to bed in sketchy areas. Traveling merchants or guards might catch a nap in a gambeson, a thick padded jacket that's more about protection and cushioning than spiritual support through prayer alone. And let's not forget, armor isn't exactly subtle. Roll the wrong way and you could make a racket loud enough to wake the whole neighborhood, convincing everyone the apocalypse has arrived. Back when demons at night, lice, and pigs in the bed were all just Tuesday. You might think sleepwalking was just a medieval nuisance. Nope, it was way more dramatic. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering around in your sleep, people didn't blame stress or exhaustion. Nope, they figured you were possessed, cursed, or had some unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking to impress the local monk wasn't really a thing, they mostly just feared it. The idea of someone getting up from their straw mattress, shuffling around the room, and staring at a wall wasn't seen as harmless insomnia. It was more like a demon rehearsal dinner. Records from the time show people were genuinely terrified of sleepwalkers. Picture this: a guy in a long nightshirt, holding a candle, eyes glazed over, mumbling Latin nonsense while stepping over livestock. You'd think ghost, heretic, or both. If you rolled the wrong way, you could make such a racket, everyone woke up thinking the apocalypse was here again. Back when demons at night, lice, and pigs in beds weren't weird, you might think sleepwalking was just a medieval nuisance. But no, it's way more dramatic. Sleepwalking wasn't just a silly quirk. In the Middle Ages, if you started wandering while asleep, folks didn't chalk it up to stress or exhaustion. Stress or exhaustion? Nope. They thought you were demon-possessed, cursed, or still had unfinished business with the Holy Roman Empire. Sleepwalking or nighttime wandering to impress the local monk, still a mystery and generally terrifying. The idea that someone could get up from a straw mattress, shuffle around the room, and stare at walls wasn't harmless insomnia. It was more like a demon's dinner rehearsal. Records from the time show people were genuinely scared of sleepwalkers. People really feared sleepwalkers. Picture this: a dude in a nightgown, candle in hand, eyes glazed over, mumbling Latin nonsense while wandering through livestock. You'd probably think ghost or heretic, or maybe both, depending on the local priest. An exorcism might be scheduled before breakfast. Some believed sleepwalking was caused by bad moods, especially too much black bile, a classic medieval catch-all explanation for the weird stuff. Others thought it happened because the soul temporarily escaped during sleep. To stop these nighttime adventures, people tried everything from herbal remedies to praying in bed, hanging iron charms, or in the countryside, just tying the sleepwalker's feet to a chair. If that sounds extreme, remember some medieval houses had open fireplaces, knives everywhere, and chamber pots just waiting for a tragic spill. Then, things got weirder, with rumors of folks climbing onto roofs in their sleep, whether those stories were exaggerated or not. The fear of sleepwalkers jumping off roofs led to barred windows and some heated theological debates on whether you could even sin while unconscious. Luckily, most sleepwalkers just paced around, mumbled nonsense, or tried to open imaginary doors. But if one sleepwalked into a church, locals might see it as a holy sign, or call for a cleansing ritual just to cover up some spiritual ceremony. If medieval life taught us anything, it's how to sleep through chaos, church bells, thunderstorms, livestock howling, and the occasional siege alarm. For the sleep-deprived medieval denizen, that was just background noise, the original white noise. Let's start with the bells. Church bells marked every sacred moment of the day: dawn, prayer hours, meals, and of course, the 2 or 3 a.m. prayer session. If you lived near a monastery, your dreams might be timed by those steady tolls. Eventually, your brain just accepts it. Bells become a lullaby for a soul that's way too busy. And it's not just bells. Storms were frequent and terrifying. No weather apps or triple pane windows. Each thunderclap felt like the world ending. Leaky roofs, rattling windows, and howling chimneys that sounded like banshees. Still, people slept. They had to. Work didn't pause for insomnia. Neither did farming, praying, or running from Vikings. Speaking of which, invasions and apocalyptic events weren't always big bedtime spoilers. In the 14th century, folks kept sleeping through famines, wars, and even the Black Death when funeral wagons rumbled past in the morning. People saw it as a scary wake-up call, not a panic trigger, and if you didn't wake up, some believed it was just lucky. There are even records of people sleeping through earthquakes, fires, and angry mobs. Sleep deprivation was common, and bodies adapted. If you worked from dawn to dusk, ate just enough to survive, and spent your days dodging mud, taxes, and spiritual curses, you'd sleep like a rock. Some even saw sleep as an escape, facing illness, grief, or the nearly every century predicted apocalypse. Some just curled up under their cloaks, muttered prayers, and slept it off. There's a strange kind of wisdom in that. In the winter of 1692 Salem, Massachusetts wasn't just buried under snow. It was blanketed in tension, suspicion, and quiet fear creeping into wooden houses and frozen fields, the Puritan town was strict, religious, and superstitious. They believed they were building a holy community in the wilderness, a city on a hill watched over by God and stalked by Satan. Life was tough. The village had just split politically and religiously from Salem town. Crops failed. Smallpox ravaged nearby communities. Wars with native tribes left many wounded. Neighbors fought. Inheritance disputes brewed, and deep resentment simmered against outsiders or anyone not fitting in. Add to that a long, dark, brutal New England winter, and something was bound to snap. The trouble started at the house of Pastor Samuel Parris, the village minister, his 9-year-old daughter. There was neighborly drama, inheritance squabbles, and deep grudges against outsiders or anyone who didn't quite fit in. Add to that a long, dark, brutal New England winter, and yeah, something was bound to snap. It all went down at Reverend Samuel Parris's place. The village preacher, his 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, started acting seriously weird. They screamed nonstop, threw stuff around, twisted their bodies in ways no human should. Sometimes they'd just go silent for hours, eyes wide with terror. The neighbors whispered that they were cursed. The girls claimed they were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Reverend Parris, clueless, called in a local doc named William, were being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Pastor Parris, clueless and out of options, called in a local doctor named William Griggs. After finding no physical cause, Griggs dropped a bombshell diagnosis that threw the village into chaos witchcraft. Just one word, and Salem's simmering fear exploded. In a place where witches were thought to be the devil's own henchmen, this idea wasn't so far-fetched. And if the devil could sneak into the pastor's house, what did that mean for the rest of the community? Pushed by grown-ups and peers, the girls started naming names. First, they pointed fingers at outcast women, those who didn't fit in and were shunned. But soon, accusations reached the respected, the wealthy, even the pious. Salem was a small village, but what happened next echoed far beyond its borders. What started as whispers in the dark would soon become screams from the gallows and leave a legacy of paranoia haunting American history books. As the idea of witchcraft took root in Salem, it spread like ivy quiet at first, then choking everything in its path. The suffering girls, Betty Parris, Abigail Williams, and soon others like Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis seemed to grow bolder by the day. They convulsed in court, screamed during prayers, and claimed they saw dark spirits hovering over parts of the village. This wasn't childish imagination. It was theatrical, public, and worst of all, believed. The first accused were society's most vulnerable women, those living on the fringe. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar famous for mumbling to herself when kicked off doorsteps. People thought her mumbling was a curse. She smoked a pipe, she yelled at kids, she fit the witch stereotype because she sure didn't fit the Puritan lady mold. Sarah Osborne hadn't been to church in over a year and shocked the town by marrying a servant after her first husband died. A woman openly defying convention was obviously suspicious. Tituba, the slave woman in Pastor Parris's household, was the oddest of all. From Barbados, her storytelling, accent, and folk culture terrified the villagers. Under pressure, maybe even a beating, Tituba confessed to being a witch, but instead of clearing things up, her confession blew everything wide open. She told tales of a tall man in black, a devil-related figure, who demanded she sign a book. She claimed to see strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even ghost dogs. But the worst accusation? She insisted there were other witches in Salem. That was all the court needed to hear. When Tituba opened the floodgates, others rushed in. New names were added weekly. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Old grudges disguised as righteous accusations. Property disputes morphed into witch attacks. If someone's cow suddenly died, obviously a witch did it. If a child cried during prayer, clearly the devil was to blame. Fear spread so much that even the innocent stayed silent. Defending an accused witch was like signing your own death warrant. Silence was safety, and so the web of accusations grew, trapping the village in invisible, sticky threads. Logic was slipping away. Panic had taken over everything. As accusations piled up and the village reached its breaking point, the colonial government stepped in. Governor William Phips, freshly appointed and eager to keep order, set up a special court to deal with the chaos. The web of accusations kept growing, trapping the whole village in sticky, invisible threads. Logic was slowly slipping away. Panic had taken full control. As accusations piled up and the village hit meltdown mode, colonial authorities stepped in. Governor William Phips, fresh on the job and eager to keep order, set up a special court to handle the chaos. This was the Oyer and Terminer Court, French for to hear and determine, but really, it was a fear factory wrapped in legal robes. The court convened in Salem in June 1692, and it was anything but normal. Panic had twisted the rules. Instead of demanding solid evidence or trustworthy witnesses, it welcomed something way scarier: spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant testimony that the accused's ghost or spirit was haunting the victim. In other words, if someone claimed they saw your ghost, well, congratulations, you were basically toast. Ghostly evidence means testimony that the accused's spirit or ghost haunted the victim. In other words, if someone swore they saw your spooky ghost self in a nightmare that left them gasping for air, that was good enough for court. No need to care if the accused was snoozing in church or miles away. Their spirit supposedly did the devil's dirty work. You can't cross-examine a dream. And, worse, you can't disprove it. Kids became the star witnesses. Their convulsions, screams, and gasps got more dramatic by the day in court. A girl named Mary Walcott would start twitching the moment a suspected witch entered the room. If a prisoner looked at her, she'd scream. If they didn't, she'd scream louder. The performances were mesmerizing. Judges, including the respected Samuel Sewall and Chief Justice William Stoughton, bought it all. No defense lawyers allowed. That concept didn't exist in colonial trials. If you were accused, you were on your own. Deny the charges, and the poor girls suffered. Confess, and you might dodge death if you fingered someone else. This system rewarded snitching and punished silence. Even worse, the trials turned into public circus acts. Folks from nearby towns showed up just to watch. The accused were dragged in chains, usually confused, poor, and basically powerless. But not everyone bought the act. Some townsfolk whispered that the girls were faking it. Others wondered why only certain types of people were accused. But very few spoke out loud. Questioning the court meant questioning God's will. In Salem, reason was tossed aside, and the law became a mirror of fear, not justice. On June 10th, 1692, Salem's gallows claimed its first victim, Bridget Bishop. She wasn't new to scandal. Her reputation made her an easy target. She wore bright red, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years earlier. During the trial, neighbors testified that her ghost haunted them at night, that their children died after she passed by, and that she kept cursed dolls. She denied everything. Still, the court found her guilty. She was led to Gallows Hill, a bleak, windy spot just outside Salem. No prayers, no mercy. The rope was tightened. The crowd watched, and with that one move, the death machine kicked into gear. The hangings were swift. On July 19th, 5 more women were executed: Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wilds. Some held decent church standing. Rebecca Nurse's case, in particular, was shocking. An elderly, devout woman loved by the community. Even the initial jury declared her innocent. But under pressure from the court and the afflicted girls, the verdict flipped. Her last words hung in the air like a warning: "I am as innocent as a newborn child." But it didn't matter. The noose didn't discriminate. August saw more executions. September 22nd, the deadliest day, saw 8 hanged in one morning. Among them was Martha Corey, a woman skeptical of the trials from the start, and her husband, Giles Corey, who met a different fate. Giles refused to plead. The court couldn't hold a trial without him, so they used an old English punishment, peine forte et dure. He was pressed to death, stones piled slowly on his chest, stretched over 3 days. Legend says his last words carried more weight than those stones. By the end of the frenzy, 19 were hanged, 1 pressed to death, and at least 5 others died in jail waiting for trial. Dozens lied to save their skins. Over 200 people were accused. The gallows cast a long shadow over Salem, not just on the hill, but in every heart. Fear became law, and justice, blindfolded, was led to the chopping block. While the executions grabbed headlines, hundreds more sat in cramped, stinky jails, waiting for a verdict or a miracle. Salem's tiny jail couldn't hold all of them. The accused witches were locked up in nearby towns like Ipswich and Boston, chained to walls, starved, frozen, and forgotten. Most accused weren't witches or even outcasts. They were neighbors, friends, parents, kids, just folks guilty of arguing with the wrong person or owning land someone else wanted. Often, the accusations were just personal grudges dressed up as holy justice, like a pig that wandered into a neighbor's yard and died. Yep, definitely witchcraft. Someone refused to help carry firewood, obviously cursed. The axe. Mary East, sister of the executed nurse Rebecca, was one such case. A respectable mother of 7 and known for her piety. At first, the court released her, but days later she was arrested again for new fits from the afflicted girls. Her second arrest sealed her fate. In her final plea to the judges, Mary begged not for her life, but to end the madness before more innocent blood was spilled. She was hanged soon after. Another notable case, Dorothy Good, 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good. After her mom's arrest, Dorothy was grilled and pressured to confess she was a witch. Her terrified babbling was taken as truth. She was chained up and locked away for 8 months. When finally freed, She was mentally broken and never recovered from the trauma. Pregnant women didn't get a free pass either. Elizabeth Proctor, later hanged by her husband John Proctor, was convicted and sentenced to death, but since she was pregnant, her execution got postponed. That probably saved her life. She gave birth in jail and was eventually released after the trials ended. Accusations kept pouring in. Some accused confessed in desperation to avoid death. Then named, others to save themselves. Entire families got sucked into this mess days. Wives, daughters, no one was safe. Meanwhile, jails overflowed. Food ran out. Diseases spread. Some died waiting for trial, lost in legal madness, and new names were added every week. Salem. Who you were didn't matter anymore. All it took was someone willing to say your name. By fall 1692, the panic started to fade, not because the courts saw the light, but because reality forced a hard stop. Again. The turning point came when the accusations got downright ridiculous. Those who once backed the trials suddenly found themselves on the wrong side. Reverend George Burroughs, former Salem minister, was arrested and charged as the witch ring leader. He was educated, well-spoken, and had clashed with powerful village families before. Enough was enough. But on execution day, Burroughs did something shocking. Standing on the gallows, he flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something they said witches couldn't do. The crowd went silent. Some cried. Even seasoned onlookers were shaken. But the execution still went ahead. That moment planted doubt. Then Mary Phipps, wife of Governor William Phipps, accused people. Suddenly, the madness spread to the colony's elite. Phipps, worried by mounting criticism and chaos, finally acted. In October 1692, he dissolved the Oyer and Terminer Court, stopping all ongoing trials and executions. Public sentiment shifted. Ministers, once silent or complicit, started speaking out. Increase Mather, one of the colony's most respected theologians, condemned spectral evidence. He argued it was better to let 10 suspected witches escape than to convict one innocent person, a radical thought in a society that had believed the exact opposite for months. Those who cheered the trials began to question them. The jails were still full, but the thirst for blood, the initial frenzy, had started to cool down. Prisons were still packed, but the bloodthirst was fading. Too many respected folks were getting accused. Too many innocent people buried under the accusations. The villagers started to realize this wasn't God's justice. It was madness. Confessions ran dry. Some accusers took back their claims. Others vanished from public view. Even the loudest screamers started looking down at their feet. Fear was still hanging around, but it was worn out. People wanted stability. Officials wanted to save face. Salem, bruised and humiliated, was finally ready to wake up from its nightmare. The storm was coming, but the damage already done. By the end of 1692, the justice system that fueled the frenzy began to collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. After the Oyer and Terminer Court disbanded in October, a more cautious court, the Superior Court of Judicature, was set up in early 1693. This time, things were different. Ghostly evidence, nope, not accepted anymore. Judges grew way more skeptical of the accusers' wild claims. Result: the conviction rate slowed to a crawl. Many accused witches got acquitted. Out of 56 cases brought to the new court, most walked free. Even those who confessed started taking it back, admitting fear, torture, or pressure forced their lies. The dramatic performances of those tormented girls lost their charm. The standout case during the wrap-up was that of Reverend Samuel Willard, a respected minister who got suspected. He was never officially charged. But the fact that such a high-ranking holy man could be doubted showed just how arbitrary and corrupt the whole process had become. The once fierce court had turned cautious. They quietly started releasing prisoners. First, those with flimsy evidence, then even those who'd confessed to being witches. By order of the judge, meanwhile, families of the executed began demanding justice. John Proctor's kids filed to get his property back. Rebecca Nurse's family launched a campaign to clear her name. Over time, shame replaced fear in the community. Church congregations split. Friendships snapped. Salem's social order was shattered. Governor Phipps, realizing the colony's growing international embarrassment, pardoned the remaining prisoners in 1693. But freedom came with a price. Many families had to pay jail fees before release. Imagine losing your home, health, and almost your life just to get a bill for the privilege of surviving. By the trial's end, 19 were hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in jail, and over 200 accused. The court didn't just collapse, it blew up, leaving a deep crater of guilt, grief, and doubt. The trials ended, but healing hadn't even started. Salem was a village forever, changed by the lives lost, justice abandoned, and the mirror it was now forced to stare into. The gallows were silent, the jail empty, but Salem was far from peaceful. The town wasn't haunted by demons, it was haunted by guilt. What began with a small group of sick girls exploded into a community wrecking ball. Families torn apart, reputations ruined, and too many innocent lives ended. Now the survivors had to live in the rubble. Neighbors couldn't even look each other in the eye. Those who once prayed together now testified against each other. Some of the tormented girls quietly slipped out of town. Others faded from the public eye. Some, like Ann Putnam Jr., later showed remorse. In 1706, she stood before her congregation and publicly apologized for her role in the trials, blaming Satan's illusions. But for many, the damage was beyond words. The judges had to face their own responsibilities. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the most prominent figures in the trials, was among the few to admit wrongdoing in a rare public act of repentance. He stood in church in 1697 while a minister read his confession and prayer for forgiveness, taking responsibility when everyone else just wanted to forget. Not easy. Families of the condemned started demanding. Everyone tried to blame Satan's illusions for their roles in the trials, but for many, the damage was beyond words. The judges had to face their own share of blame. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the big players in the trials, was among the few to admit he'd screwed up. In a rare public act of remorse, he stood in church in 1697 while a minister read out his confession and prayers for forgiveness. That was a rare moment of owning the mess in a time when most folks just wanted to forget it all. Families of the condemned started demanding compensation. For years, petitions went to Massachusetts officials asking for official pardons, property returned, and public recognition that those executed were innocent. The government dragged its feet. In 1711, the colony passed a law restoring rights and reputations for some victims and offered limited financial compensation to their heirs. But even that was far from complete. Some families, like the Chorus and the Proctors, were completely left out. Rumors about witches never left New England, but in Salem, the shame became part of the town's identity. The village eventually changed its name to Danvers, probably trying to ditch its embarrassing past. Gallows Hill was never officially marked, as if the town hoped to bury not just the dead, but the memory of what happened too. But the memory lingered in sermons, stories, and the silence between old friends. Salem wasn't cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear, pride, and uncontrollable power, and that curse stuck around long after the executions ended. The Salem witch trials wrapped up over 3 centuries ago, but their legacy still echoes not just in textbooks and tourist traps, but in how we think about justice, fear, and the fragility of truth. What happened in 1692 wasn't just some bizarre mass hysteria. It was the breakdown of logic, compassion, and legal integrity in the face of panic. Ordinary folks, farmers, midwives, pastors ended up as executioners just because they were too gullible and asked too few questions. The court, which was supposed to protect the innocent, became an instrument of oppression. Religion turned into a weapon. Testimonies became theater, and silence became guilt. One of the creepiest parts of the Salem tragedy is how fast it all spiraled in just a few months. Fear beat truth. Old grudges disguised as spiritual warfare became death sentences. No demons or devils needed, just belief in them. But these trials also taught us some pricey lessons that spread across American society. In the years and centuries after, Salem kept popping up in debates about due process and civil rights. The U.S. Constitution, written nearly a century later, clearly banned retroactive laws and coercive bills that doomed Salem's accused, the guarantees of legal counsel, the right to face accusers, and the demand for concrete evidence are hard principles born partly from the ashes of Gallows Hill in modern times. The phrase witch hunt has become shorthand for political persecution or moral panic, though it's often tossed around without much thought for the real horror those words stand for. Truth is, Salem isn't a metaphor. It was a town where people were hanged for made-up crimes, betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. Maybe the deepest lesson is, this unchecked fear can become tyranny, and when fear is legalized by power, courts, churches, governments, it's almost unstoppable. The Salem witch trials are a cautionary tale not just about a village gone mad, but how reason can crumble when fear takes the throne. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning remains. Truth is fragile, justice isn't automatic, and history tends to repeat itself unless we remember. Fulvia was born around 83 BC into the somewhat quirky, upper-class Fulvia family, an old plebeian clan that had long climbed the ranks of Roman politics. Not the oldest noble family, but the Fulvias had produced plenty of advisors, generals, and orators. Their blood carried ambition and a taste for shaking things up. Fulvia's father, Marcus Fulvius Bambalio, was better known for his awkward speeches than his political legacy. His nickname, Bambalio, actually referred to his stutter, but Fulvia, she didn't stutter. She was born to lead. From a young age, Fulvia was surrounded by the harsh world of Roman power. Senators and generals debated policy at her home. Elections and betrayals were daily news. She saw that politics didn't just happen in fancy forums, it crashed weddings, funerals, gossip circles, and shady backroom deals. Women in Rome's upper crust were supposed to be discreet, classy, educated, and obedient spouses. Enter Fulvia, who shattered every one of those expectations. She was rich, highly educated, so well-connected, and fully aware of it. Her childhood remains a bit of a mystery, but her later actions show she was a sharp, politically savvy young woman who wasn't scared of anything. Not exactly your average wallflower. She had a fierce personality, razor-sharp political instincts, and the guts to act even in the male-dominated political world of Rome. And this was no peaceful era. The Republic was falling apart. Civil wars, popular uprisings, and power struggles between generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar turned Rome into a pressure cooker. The old rules were crumbling, and Fulvia grew up right in the middle of the chaos. Instead of cowering, she learned to use it. Her childhood didn't reflect the modest woman Rome idealized. Instead, it crafted a woman who saw politics not as a scary men's club, but a battlefield to conquer. She married 3 powerful men, each a progressive figure in Roman history. But Fulvia didn't just marry power. She commanded armies, led uprisings, and became the first Roman woman to appear on coins not as a goddess, but as herself. Rome wasn't ready for Fulvia, but she was ready for Rome. Her first marriage was to Publius, Clodius Pulcher, and it was anything but conventional. Clodius was no typical Roman noble. He was a populist rabble-rouser, a political arsonist with a taste for chaos, scandals, and street power to many Roman elites. He was dangerous to the masses, a hero, and to Fulvia, a strategic opportunity. They married in the early 50s BC, reuniting her with the man who turned the Roman Republic into his personal stage. Clodius was infamous for flouting tradition theatrically. He once dressed as a woman just to sneak into a women-only religious ceremony at Caesar's house. His scandalous antics only boosted his fame later. He gave up his noble status to run for tribune of the plebs, a position that gave him veto power over the Senate. Clodius knew Rome's street politics better than most, and Fulvia wasn't a passive wife. She was always by his side, not just a silent partner. Roman sources say Fulvia was deeply involved in her husband's political world. She mingled with his supporters, showed up at his campaigns, and ran their household as Clodius's political HQ. Together, they were Rome's new power couple, bold, populist, and unafraid to throw down. But this alliance came at a price. In 52 BC, Clodius was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political rival, Titus Annius Milo. His death shook Rome to its core, but Fulvia wasn't about to sit quietly and mourn. She threw a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated body through the Roman Forum, bloodied wounds on full display for maximum dramatic effect. The public was horrified and furious. Riots exploded. The Senate building was burned down. Fulvia turned personal grief into public uprising. This was her first big political move, and it worked. Her knack for manipulating public emotion, using spectacle as a strategy, and weaponizing her husband's legacy made her a new kind of player in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia stepped out of the shadows, and Rome would never see her the same way again. She left behind no trace of sorrow. In Rome, political power was short-lived, and she knew it better than anyone. Soon after, the new power couple of Rome bold, populist, and not afraid to throw punches. But this alliance came with a price. In 52 BC, Clodius was assassinated on the Appian Way by the bodyguards of his political enemy, Titus Annius Milo. His death shook Rome to its core, but Fulvia wasn't about to mourn quietly. She threw a political funeral that historians still talk about today. She paraded Clodius's mutilated corpse through the Roman Forum, showing off the bloody wounds for maximum effect. The public was horrified and outraged. Riots broke out. The Senate building was burned down. Fulvia had turned personal grief into a full-blown public uprising. This was her big political debut, and it worked. Her skill at manipulating public emotion, using spectacle as strategy, and wielding her husband's legacy as a weapon made her a new force in Roman politics. Clodius was gone, but Fulvia stepped out of the shadows, and Rome would never look at her the same way again. Fulvia wasn't just sadness anymore. In Rome, political power had a short shelf life, and she knew that better than anyone. Right after Claudius Pulcher kicked the bucket unexpectedly, she jumped straight into round 2 of marriage, this time with Gaius Scribonius Curio, a rising political star and one of Julius Caesar's biggest fans. On paper, Curio didn't seem much of a contender. He was known as a show-off and drama lover, but beneath that flashy exterior was a sharp politician. As tribune of the plebs in 50 BC, Curio held serious sway during one of Rome's messiest periods. The Republic was swinging wildly between war and peace. Caught between Caesar's ambitions and the Senate's stubborn resistance, Fulvia didn't just see Curio as a husband. He was her ticket to the next big power block. This wasn't some lovey-dovey rebound. It was a carefully calculated alliance. After Claudius died, Fulvia needed a new political captain, someone who could carry on the populist legacy her first husband built and still had Caesar's backing. Curio ticked both boxes. Thanks to him, Fulvia stayed glued to Rome's ever-shifting power game. She didn't just join the movement, she helped shape it. Fulvia kept Claudius's supporters active, refocused their goals under Curio's lead, and kept the urban mobs politically engaged. But the Roman world was collapsing fast. The tension between Caesar and Pompey exploded into civil war. Curio jumped in, siding with Caesar. Fulvia, as usual, stayed busy in politics. She reportedly helped organize support and manage resources for her husband's campaign. In 49 BC, Curio led a military expedition to Africa to protect Caesar's interests. But surprise, it was a disaster. He was ambushed and killed by King Juba of Numidia's forces. Brutal end, and his army was wiped out. Once again, Fulvia was a widow, and once again, Rome waited to see if she'd fade into the background. Spoiler, she did not. Curio's death only cemented her reputation as a dangerously resilient political widow. She'd lost 2 husbands to Rome's civil chaos, both dying fighting for populist causes. But Fulvia wasn't done yet. Her boldest move and most dramatic chapter hadn't even started. Her third and most famous marriage was to Mark Antony, the ambitious general and loyal Caesar ally. They got hitched around 47 BC, and it was more than just a love story. It was a merger of power. Fulvia proved herself the queen of Roman street politics. Antony was climbing fast in military and political ranks and needed savvy support in Rome. Together, they became one of the most politically potent couples of the Republic by the time they married. Fulvia was no stranger to bloodshed and betrayal. She'd buried 2 husbands and crushed countless enemies. Antony wasn't exactly innocent either. The guy drank, gambled, and had a personal life messier than a tavern floor. But with Fulvia, he found someone who did way more than just entertain him. She could protect his interests, keep his alliances intact, and rally supporters during his campaigns. And Antony, despite his brash style, got her value. He let Fulvia wield power no Roman woman had ever dared in public before. She opened his letters, gave orders when he was away, attended meetings, and influenced appointments. Roman sources, mostly hostile, paint her as bossy and power-hungry. But what scared them most wasn't her ambition. The real issue was she acted like a Roman man in a world with no words for a woman like her. After Caesar's assassination, Sodis, 44 BC, the Republic plunged into chaos again. Antony rushed to secure his spot as Caesar's political heir, but it was Fulvia who held Rome's fort, while Antony formed the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. Fulvia played his rep in the capital, managing patronage networks, coordinating street gangs, and making sure Antony's supporters were always mobilized. She even helped arrange the official peace between Antony and Octavian by marrying her daughter, Claudia, off to him, a political alliance that would later blow up publicly. Fulvia wasn't just Antony's wife, she was his stand-in. Roman coins were minted bearing Antony's image and name, a first ever nod to her status. She didn't hide in power's shadows. She stood right in its blinding light. But power in Rome was always borrowed power, and Fulvia was about to test just how far a woman could push before Rome had enough. While Mark Antony was off chasing military campaigns and political deals across the Roman world, Fulvia was running the streets of Rome. She wasn't just his wife. She was his regent in every way except the fancy title, back when violence, bribery, and brute force were the name of the game. Fulvia proved she could play it better than any guy in the Senate. Rome, after Caesar's assassination, was a swordless battlefield. Power was basically a moving target. Fulvia got that and shored up Antony's power in the capital by being his political stand-in. She managed allies, dealt with the urban mobs, negotiated between factions, and most boldly, waged wars of words and coinage. She funded loyal armies, bribed to keep the peace, and made sure any laws passed favored Antony's future. Some ancient sources, especially the hostile ones like Appian and Dio Cassius, paint Fulvia as cunning, sharp-tongued, and even warmongering. But beneath the misogynistic hype was a woman actively involved in politics in a world where women were basically just supposed to knit and whimper. Fulvia built alliances, supported military commanders, and even issued edicts, stuff usually reserved for senators and advisors. She also showed up in public, kept tight ties with veteran soldiers, a crucial political demographic in the final power struggles of the Republic. While Antony campaigned in the East, Fulvia was often the face of his power in Italy, meeting commanders, influencing land distribution, and reminding soldiers their loyalty to Antony would pay off. But stacking all that power came at a cost. The Roman elite, especially those allied with Octavian Caesar's heir and Antony's rising rival, were furious about Fulvia's influence. They saw her as an interfering woman wielding way too much power over legions, laws, and loyalty. Her ability to act without male supervision wasn't just threatening, it was unprecedented. Fulvia wasn't naive. She knew the tension between Antony and Octavian was heating up. She could see their alliance fracturing, and she understood something neither man fully grasped. The Republic wasn't big enough for both of them. So, Fulvia started prepping for the next move, not diplomacy confrontation. She'd backed power long enough. Now, she was ready to grab it herself. In 41 BC, Fulvia did the unthinkable. She went to war against Octavian, the future Augustus, and she didn't do it quietly. While her husband Antony was camped in the east, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother and a consul, challenged Octavian's power in Italy themselves. Why, on the surface, it was about defending Antony's interests and the land rights of loyal Roman veterans. But underneath it all, Fulvia's fingerprints were everywhere. This was no ordinary politics. This was a military revolt led by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Roman history a woman actively stirred up and organized a civil war. The conflict, called the Perusian War, broke out over Octavian's controversial land redistribution plan that displaced many Italians to reward his soldiers. Fulvia seized on the growing unrest, painting Octavian as a tyrant and betrayer of Caesar's legacy. With Lucius fronting as the Senate's leader and Fulvia pulling strings backstage, they raised 8 legions and took the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Don't get it twisted, this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources say she invested more in the conflict than Lucius. She rallied troops, campaigned among the masses, and even exchanged letters with generals. Chaos everywhere. This wasn't just politics. This was a military rebellion led by a Roman woman. The first and only time in Roman history a woman actively stirred up and organized a civil war. The conflict, known as the Perusian War, kicked off over Octavian's controversial land redistribution plan, where many Italians got booted to reward his soldiers. Fulvia caught onto the growing grumbling, painting Octavian as a tyrant and a traitor to Caesar's legacy, with Lucius playing the Senate head and Fulvia pulling strings behind the scenes. They raised 8 legions and took over the city of Perugia, modern-day Perugia. Don't get it twisted, so this was Fulvia's war. Ancient sources say she invested more into this conflict than Lucius did. She rallied troops, whipped up the crowds, and even traded letters with generals. Rome buzzed with rumors she was calling the shots, issuing orders, and strong-arming Lucius into fights he'd rather skip. Octavian, though caught off guard, acted fast. He laid siege to Perugia all through the winter of 41 BC, cutting off supplies and forcing the city to surrender. Fulvia, stuck between hunger and political backstabbing, watched her bold gamble collapse. By early 43rd BC, the city had given up. She was shipped off to Sicyon in Greece, hoping for a reunion with Antony. But Antony didn't rush over. The solid alliance between husband and wife had been corroded by war and distance. Fulvia acted on his behalf, but maybe without his blessing. She dared to do something no Roman woman had before start a civil war, and now the Republic was making her pay. Kicked out of Rome, Fulvia landed in Sicyon, a Greek city that had become a diplomatic purgatory for fallen power players. She went to battle not for herself, but for her husband, She believed she was defending Mark Antony's interests, honor, and maybe their shared big picture vision for Rome. But what waited for her in exile wasn't a hero's welcome, it was silence. Fulvia risked everything: her status, alliances, life. Yet Antony didn't rush to her side. Actually, when Fulvia got to Greece, Antony was tangled up in drama with Cleopatra in Egypt. Whether their romance was just starting or already full blown, the symbolism was wild. While Fulvia was rallying legions, Antony was raising glasses at parties next to a queen. This betrayal stung deeply, not just personally, but politically. Fulvia fought to protect Antony's power in Italy, and in return, he left her stranded there. Some ancient historians, especially Plutarch, say Antony was furious she kicked off the Perusian War without his direct go-ahead. Others think he welcomed her downfall. This cleared the path for a political marriage alliance with Octavian, something Fulvia would never accept. Still, she wasn't without supporters. Some of Antony's soldiers, fiercely loyal to her, pushed for peace. But her health started sliding downhill after sieges, exile, and betrayal. Fulvia died in Sicyon in 40 BC, maybe from illness, stress, heartbreak, or all three. She was about 43. Her death gave Antony a clean political exit. Soon after, he met Octavian and agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, as part of a new peace deal. The trio patched things up, but only because Fulvia, the only woman bold enough to challenge their schemes, was out of the picture. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, the queen with her own legendary flair. Most Roman women back then wouldn't dream of such boldness. But don't get it twisted, Fulvia was the original trailblazer. She didn't wield power from behind the scenes. She stepped into the spotlight, stood in the center, and dared to command armies in a world that treated women like furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so it tried to erase her, but the echoes of her rebellion lingered, and her story is anything but ordinary. After Fulvia's death in 40 BC, the people she once commanded, Antony, Octavian, even some old allies, quietly started rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the story was shaped by her enemies and the annoyed survivors of her ambitions. Like many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly penned by self-interested parties, blamed her for the Perusian War, the split between Antony and Octavian, and even the Republic's general chaos. Ion, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch painted her as bossy, jealous, and power-hungry. They accused her of dragging Lucius Antonius into conflict, making enemies of Octavian, and even causing Antony's final estrangement from Rome. Soon after, he met Octavian and agreed to marry Octavia, Octavian's sister, as part of a new peace treaty. The trio patched things up, but only because Fulvia, the only woman brave enough to challenge their plot, was out of the picture. Fulvia's legacy would soon be overshadowed by Cleopatra, who came with a whole mythology of her own. Most Roman women back then weren't like her, but make no mistake, Fulvia was the original. She didn't cling to power from behind the scenes. She stormed in, stood front and center, and dared to command armies in a world that saw women as mere furniture. Rome didn't know what to do with her, so they tried to erase her, but the fallout from her rebellion still lingered, and her story is anything but ordinary. after Fulvia died in 40 BC. Among those she once mobilized: Antony, Octavian. Even her old allies quietly started rewriting her legacy. She couldn't defend herself, so the narrative was shaped by her enemies and the uncomfortable survivors of her ambitions. Like many powerful women in history, Fulvia became a scapegoat. Ancient sources, mostly written by interested parties, blamed her for the Perusian War, the split between Antony and Octavian, and even the Republic's general chaos. Aeon, Dio Cassius, and Plutarch painted her as bossy, jealous, and power-hungry. They blamed her for dragging Lucius Antonius into the conflict, making enemies of Octavian and even Antony's eventual break with Rome. But were these accusations fair, harsh? Yes. Fulvia operated in a political world where violence and manipulation were just business as usual, at least if you were a man. She wasn't more ambitious than Caesar, not more aggressive than Pompey, and no crueler than Octavian down the line. Her only real difference: she was a woman acting like a Roman man, and Rome had no clue how to handle that. She didn't live quietly at home, knitting or serving as political eye candy. She wrote letters to generals, rallied street mobs, and commanded army loyalty, and that made her dangerous, not just to Octavian, but to history itself. Even Mark Antony, the guy she fought to protect, blamed Fulvia for the Civil War after making peace with Octavian and marrying his sister. Antony used Fulvia's death as a diplomatic cleanse. Her memory became the political cost of his survival. No statues, no grand funerals, no morning Senate speeches, just silence. But her enemies couldn't erase her completely. Fulvia did way too much. She raised armies, ran elections, brokered alliances, and kicked off a civil war. She was the first Roman woman to have her name on coins, not as a goddess or a metaphor, but as a political player. Smearing her reputation was deliberate, but so was her presence in the historical record. Despite all the caricatures and slander, Fulvia refused to disappear. Her defiance still echoes. You just have to listen to those guys. Fulvia's story ends in silence, but her legacy loud and clear for centuries after her death. Historians and writers struggled to fit her into Rome's grand narrative because Fulvia broke every rule for what a Roman woman should be. She wasn't just a power behind the scenes. She was the power, and that made her unforgettable and deeply threatening to a patriarchal world. In a society where women were supposed to influence by whispering and marrying, Fulvia screamed through politics, war, and the political stage. She wasn't a side piece. She was a commander. Yet, she's remembered more for her rebelliousness than her achievements. Roman historians couldn't stomach a woman who didn't know her place, so they rewrote her as loud, power-hungry, and troublemaking. But if you read between the lines, you see someone else. Fulvia was the first Roman woman to mint coins with her name on them. She organized political factions, weaponized marriage, and masterfully manipulated Roman street politics. She didn't just witness the 1st century BC Civil War, she played in it. A powerhouse woman who terrified senators and shaped the fate of the triumvirate. Her downfall wasn't incompetence, it was timing and gender. If she'd been born a man, she might be remembered as a second Caesar or a more charming Cato. Instead, she got cast as a wicked woman who dared to do too much. Still, her legacy quietly lives on, Later, Roman women like Livia Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and even Cleopatra, though from a different world, operated under the shadow Fulvia helped. Caste. They manipulated emperors, commanded armies, and controlled succession. But Fulvia did it first, without any royal titles to shield her. Nowadays, modern historians are starting to look at Fulvia with fresh eyes. No longer just a cautionary tale. She's being recognized as one of the most politically active women in Roman history, a woman who pushed the limits of female power and paid the price. She didn't just live in the triumvirate era. Roman history, a woman who pushed the limits of female power and paid the price. She didn't just live through the age of the triumvirate. She challenged it, and while Rome might have tried to erase her, Fulvia left her mark in every crack of its collapse. Not just a footnote, but a force. A woman centuries ahead of her time. By the summer of 1963, the United States was a country teetering between two worlds. On one side, a centuries-old system of oppression. On the other, a desperate hunger for freedom out in the Deep South. Racism wasn't just the norm, it was the law of the land. Racial segregation down there wasn't just a social quirk, it was baked in everywhere you looked. It was the law. Black Americans were banned from restaurants, schools, buses, voting booths, and even drinking fountains. Police brutality was rampant. Lynchings still happened, and in places like Birmingham, Alabama, peaceful protesters got met with attack dogs and fire hoses. Charming, right? But change was coming, and it wasn't asking for permission. In just a few years, the civil rights movement became the talk of the entire nation. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and boycotts turned into headline staples. Leaders like Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and John Lewis weren't just names anymore. They were symbols of defiance. The March on Washington didn't pop out of nowhere. It was the boiling point of rising frustration and fierce hope. Black Americans were done playing the waiting game. They demanded civil rights and were ready to shout it from the most important stage, the nation's capital. The idea of a huge march in Washington. D.C. had been kicking around for decades. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer and longtime civil rights advocate, first had tossed the idea around in the 1940s. Back then, the goal was to pressure Roosevelt's administration to end racial discrimination in the defense industry. That protest got canceled after Roosevelt gave in and signed an executive order. But in 1963, the stakes were way higher. Randolph, along with other civil rights leaders like Bayard Rustin and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., revived the vision. And this time, they weren't just marching for jobs, they were marching for dignity, voting rights, desegregation in schools, equal pay, and most importantly, the basic human right to live without fear. More than a dozen major civil rights groups teamed up despite their differences, because they knew a united front packed more punch. The countdown had begun. Buses were getting lined up. Flyers flew out everywhere. Word spread faster than the press. And across the country, Black Americans were gearing up for one of the most unforgettable moments in U.S. history. The dream was slowly taking shape, step by step, pulling off any protest in Washington. D.C. isn't exactly a walk in the park, but organizing over 100,000 people, maybe even more, that's straight up madness. Logistically, it sounds like a nightmare. Food, water, transportation, sound systems, bathrooms, medical teams, permits, crowd control, safety plans. Yet somehow, they pulled it off. At the eye of this organized chaos stood Bayard Rustin, a man who, despite being openly gay and usually staying in the shadows for political reasons, was a master strategist. Rustin studied direct nonviolent action under Gandhi's followers in India. He'd marched, been jailed, beaten, and watched by the FBI, but nothing shook him. He saw the Washington March as the world's chance to prove that a disciplined, nonviolent protest could achieve anything if run with military precision. In just 8 weeks, Rustin and his crew turned the idea into reality. The march, officially called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, was deliberately built to cover both racial justice and economic opportunity. That dual message wasn't an accident. While Dr. King later became the spiritual icon of the era, Randolph and Rustin made sure the demands weren't just about unemployment, minimum wage, and labor rights, but also civil rights. Meanwhile, tensions simmered underneath the surface. President John F. Kennedy and his administration were seriously worried. They feared riots, backlash, or worse, bloodshed. Civil rights leaders assured them the march would stay peaceful. Still, the National Guard stayed ready to roll. Hospitals in D.C. were on alert, and alcohol sales were banned for the day. Even federal employees were told they might get to stay home. Meanwhile, the National Guard stayed on high alert. Hospitals in D.C. were on emergency standby, and booze sales totally banned for the day. Federal workers were even told they could just stay home. Then came the big headache: unity. 6 major civil rights groups, NAACP, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, National Urban League, and Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, were constantly butting heads over strategies. Some wanted to crank up the pressure, others leaned toward diplomacy. The young SNCC crew was getting impatient with King's nonviolent approach. But one thing was clear: the era of silence was officially over. Rustin's plan was like a military operation. Every bus and train was tracked. Each speaker was timed to the minute. Every route had police trained to handle crowds. This wasn't just a parade. They were orchestrating a full-on movement. Rustin's blueprint resembled a military campaign. Every bus and train was monitored. Each speaker's time was down to the exact minute. Police forces trained in crowd control lined every route. They weren't just organizing a march, they were staging a revolution. Every route had police specially trained to handle crowds. They weren't just planning a parade, they were staging a moment that could shake the conscience of a whole nation. August 28, 1963, a sweltering Wednesday in Washington, D.C. By 9 a.m., the sun was blazing, and the humidity stuck to skin like a second layer of clothing. But nobody cared. They came from all over black, white, young, old, students, preachers, factory workers, celebrities, some decked out in their Sunday best, others clutching protest signs like their lives depended on it. They arrived by bus, train, carpool, and even on foot. Over 250,000 people flooded the National Mall like a rising tide of hope. Yet shockingly, no chaos, despite government fears of riots and unrest. The scene was calm, almost eerily so. Volunteers directed traffic. The Red Cross handed out water. Choirs sang freedom songs. Folks held hands and cheered as new marchers arrived. You could hear gospel choirs near the reflecting pool, and hymns of Jobs and freedom echoed off the marble columns of the Lincoln Memorial. Celebrities showed up too. Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Paul Newman, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan. But nobody was there for autographs. They came to witness history and speak for something bigger than any one person. The crowd was orderly but buzzing with energy. No pushing, no looting, no violence. Instead, everyone got it. This wasn't just a protest. It was a sacred moment for many Black Americans. Just standing on the mall was a quiet revolution, a way to be seen, counted, to say we are here, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where the great emancipator sits carved in stone. This was a lifetime moment for generations. At exactly noon, the programs officially kicked off. Leaders took the stage one by one, each representing different groups, ideologies, and regions. But united in message, the speakers demanded equal pay, an end to school segregation, a living wage, and a stop to police brutality. Mahalia Jackson sang, Marian Anderson, once banned from Constitution Hall because of her race, now sang for thousands under the open sky. As time passed, tension grew, not from fear, but from anticipation. The man everyone was waiting for hadn't spoken yet, and when he did, the world would stop, listen, and remember. The march wasn't just history in the making. It was becoming legend, minute by mid-afternoon. The crowd had gone quiet, not tired, but knowing something big was about to happen. Standing in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped up to the podium. He wore a dark suit, a neat tie, and had a calm face that barely hid the fire burning inside. He'd prepared his speech, typed and written with his advisors the night before, but what the world remembered wasn't the script. It was what came straight from his heart. He started steady, laying out the brutal facts of racism, police violence, and broken promises. 100 years later, he said, referring to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Negro is still not free. His voice rose and fell like a sermon. He used repetition, rhythm, and silence not as filler, but as instruments. The crowd listened intently. Some nodded, some wiped tears, others held signs simply reading now. But what happened next changed the whole event, and arguably the entire civil rights movement's course. Right behind King was gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had sung earlier that day. Suddenly, she called out, "Tell them about the dream." Silence wasn't background noise. It was the main act. The crowd listened like it was the most gripping thing on earth. Some nodded. Some wiped tears. Others held signs simply saying, "Now." But what happened next? That changed everything. People were hanging on every word, some nodding, others quietly crying, while some clutched signs that just said "now." But then, the real game changer happened. Right behind King stood gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who had already sung earlier that day. Suddenly, she shouted, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream." And King did just that. The gospel queen nudged King, yelling, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream." King pushed his notes aside, gripped the podium, and launched into a speech he'd read before, just never like this. He set his notes down, grabbed the podium, and started a passage he'd read before, but never quite like this. "I have a dream," he said, and the crowd leaned in. "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Every word rang louder, clearer, more determined. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Each word hit harder, clearer, more resolute. The words echoed, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they won't be judged by the color of their skin, but by their character. This was no longer just a speech. It was a vision, a prayer, a lightning bolt through history, when King closed with, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The crowd erupted applause, tears, cheers of joy. They knew they'd just witnessed more than words. They heard prophecy. The power of the March on Washington wasn't just in the speeches or the music. It was in the people. The sheer scale of humanity coming together that day was mind-blowing. They came from Mississippi, Michigan, Alabama, New York, California, everywhere. Some were seasoned activists who'd marched dozens of times. Others had never left home until now. They packed lunches, rode buses for over 20 hours, and slept in church clothes just to be there. Many were ordinary folks' maids, teachers, steel workers, postal employees, not politicians, but witnesses. They didn't just want change, they were change. Kids were in the crowd too, young black girls with ribbons in their hair, boys holding handmade signs, parents hoisting toddlers on shoulders so they could see the Lincoln Memorial in the distance and hear the speaker's voice through loudspeakers. For them, this wasn't just an event. It was the start of a new world. Some familiar faces stood out. There was a young guy, John Lewis, just 23, representing the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. His original speech was so fiery, the bigwigs told him to tone it down just minutes before he hit the stage. He agreed, but only just enough. His call for radical change still shook the crowd. Then there was Daisy Bates, the only woman to speak that day, not on her own behalf, but reading a prepared statement. For other women fighting for civil rights, organizers faced criticism for sidelining women's voices. Bates's short but powerful message hit a hard truth, like even in a movement for equality. Some voices still struggle to be heard. Also, there were union organizers, Jewish clergy, nuns, priests, and students from all walks of life. Not everyone agreed on strategy. Some backed Martin Luther King's nonviolence. Others leaned toward Malcolm X's tougher stance. But that day, those differences didn't matter. Unity won. It was a visual symphony of America's potential. Black and white hands clasped tight in solidarity. Freedom. Now badges pinned on chests. And the breath of 250,000 souls moving as one. Faces in the crowd weren't just watching history unfold. They were shaping it, and none could forget what they saw, while the world watched unity, inspiration, and poetic justice on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Behind the scenes, the March on Washington was anything but simple. What looked like a perfectly synchronized movement was actually held together by muscle, sweat, and last-minute compromises. Bayard Rustin, the chief architect of the march, had to fight not just logistical battles, but political ones too. He was under constant scrutiny, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders feared his identity might be exploited to discredit the movement. In fact, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell once threatened to out Rustin and Dr. King as lovers if it wasn't just logistics, it was political dynamite. Rustin was under the microscope, not just because he was openly gay and a former communist, but because some civil rights leaders worried his identity could be used to discredit the entire movement. Rustin faced non-stop scrutiny, not only because he was openly gay and had a communist past, but because some leaders feared his identity would be weaponized to tarnish the movement's image. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell even threatened to out Rustin and Dr. King as lovers if King didn't kick Rustin out of a previous campaign. That threat haunted every planning session. Powell once threatened to expose Rustin and King as lovers if Rustin wasn't removed from an earlier campaign. That threat loomed over every planning meeting. Then there was the whole women's voice issue. Despite key roles played by women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height, none were invited to speak solo at the big event. Women like Ella Baker, Diane Nash, and Dorothy Height were crucial behind the scenes, but none got a solo mic moment. Rosa Parks was in the crowd, respected by all, but she didn't get to speak either. Rosa Parks was there, revered, but no microphone for her. Behind the march's glitz lay a hard truth: the movement was still wrestling with its own hierarchy and blind spots, even within the 6 major organizations. Conflict popped up. SNCC leaders grew more and more frustrated with the snail's pace of change and the old guard's stubborn demand for moderation. They wanted to confront systemic racism head on, no holding back. CORE felt the same frustration, but unity was apparently too precious to risk on just one day. Meanwhile, the federal government was watching, teeth clenched. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI sent over 100 agents to spy on the organizers. They bugged hotel rooms, stalked key players, and built dossiers. They were convinced the march would turn violent or be hijacked by communists when nothing blew up. They just ramped up the surveillance, especially on Dr. King. And don't forget the money. The march burned through over $250,000 millions in today's cash. Most of it came from unions and sympathetic donors, but the organizers were scrambling until the last minute. They even borrowed walkie-talkies from the Boy Scouts. The March on Washington was historic, sure, but it was also human, imperfect, chaotic, political, and still unfinished. Like the country, it was trying to heal. The sun began to set behind the Washington Monument as the crowd slowly dispersed. People hugged, some cried, sang, and lingered as long as they could, unwilling to leave what felt like sacred ground. But the march was over. Speeches had been made. Banners had been raised. The whole world was watching. And now, that heavy question hung in the humid August air: what's next? In the days that followed, the media's reaction was cautious but positive. Major newspapers acknowledged the historic nature of the event, usually with a curious, detached tone. Some called it an orderly, solemn march, implying no troublemakers showed up. Very few outlets spent much time on the march's specific demands, like calls for a federal jobs program or a minimum wage roughly equal to about $20 today. But everyone was tuned in to Dr. King's speech. That part was impossible to ignore. President John F. Kennedy, who had initially opposed the idea of the march, watched it unfold on TV. With growing admiration and maybe a bit of surprise, he called the event impressive and met with civil rights leaders at the White House soon after. But legislative progress was still slow. The civil rights bill he proposed stalled in Congress, caught by Southern opposition. Some activists were disappointed. They'd hoped the march would spark immediate action. Instead, it just slid back into the grind, organizing, marching, protesting, and mourning those who paid the price for justice. Just weeks later, that harsh reality hit home. On September 15th, 1963, 4 black girls were killed in a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The dream had been spoken, yes, but the nightmare was far from over, yet something had changed. The March on Washington marked a new chapter in the civil rights movement. It proved mass protests could be disciplined, powerful, and impossible to ignore. It brought together a bigger coalition than ever before: labor unions, religious leaders, celebrities, students, and working class Americans, all in one place, united by justice, and above all, it gave the movement a voice, a dream, a speech that would be quoted, studied, and echoed around the world. The march ended, but the journey was just beginning, and that journey would soon lead to bloodshed, laws, and transformation. The March on Washington didn't just shake America's conscience, it reshaped the moral landscape, starting as a bold act of protest. The march became the cornerstone legacy of the civil rights movement, forever changing how Americans understood justice. That path would soon lead to bloodshed, laws, and upheaval. The March on Washington didn't just shake America's conscience, it rewrote the moral playbook. It started as a bold protest, but became the civil rights movement's legacy cornerstone, forever changing how Americans see justice, democracy, and the power of collective action. On the legislative front, the march wasn't an instant win, but it lit a fire under the whole process. Less than a year later, in July 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. This law banned discrimination in public places and in hiring based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Then in 1965 came the Voting Rights Act, striking hard at the heart of Jim Crow laws. Would these laws have passed without the march? Maybe. But would they have carried the same moral punch and unstoppable public pressure? Probably not. For Martin Luther King Jr., that day's speech catapulted him into a new realm. He went from respected leader to global icon, but fame came with a price: surveillance, threats, and eventually his assassination in 1968. The dream he spoke of on those steps became deeper, more tragic, and more revered with every passing year. For the broader movement, the march showed what unity could achieve. It gave organizers a blueprint for massive mobilization, and it set the stage for everything that followed, inspiring a generation of activists both in the U.S. and abroad. The folks organizing against apartheid in South Africa, student protesters in Europe, and future human rights leaders worldwide all look to the March on Washington as their blueprint. But the legacy isn't just history, the language of the march, the idea of work and freedom, the image of peaceful protest. The echo of "I Have a Dream" still ring out in modern demonstrations. From the Million Man March to Black Lives Matter, these protests carry the vibes of '63 in every chant and cardboard sign waving around. Washington, D.C. Dr. King's Memorial now stands just across the tidal basin, facing the Lincoln Memorial. Visitors stroll by. His towering statue, carved in granite with words from that August day. But the monument isn't really in the stone. It lives in classrooms, polling booths, marches, and voices that refuse to be silenced because the dream wasn't meant to stay in history books. It's meant to be lived, and the legacy of that summer afternoon still dares us to do just that. Over 60 years have passed since that summer day when over 250,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. The March on Washington has been immortalized in textbooks, documentaries, and museum exhibits. Dr. King's speech is taught in schools. His voice, steady and powerful, echoes in the national memory like a sacred chorus. But for many, the question remains, has the dream come true or just been postponed in some ways? Progress is undeniable. The legal framework of racial segregation has been wiped out. Voting rights, though now under attack in many states again, were won through blood, marches, and court battles. The presence of black legislators, judges, mayors, and even a two-term U.S. president was unimaginable back in '63. Interracial marriage, once illegal in most of the country, is now federally protected. These aren't small potatoes. They're victories carved out of relentless struggle. Yet the original demands of the march, often overshadowed by King's speech, still echo unresolved. The call for a living wage hasn't been fully answered. Racial gaps in education, housing, jobs, and healthcare still exist. Police brutality, which sparked much of the early civil rights movement, continues to ignite outrage and protest. The dream of real economic justice, a country where your zip code or skin color doesn't decide your fate, is still a long way off. Modern movements like Black Lives Matter have picked up the torch, often using the imagery and language of the '63 march as both inspiration and indictment. They march through the same cities, chant on the same streets, demanding basic human rights, but they do it in a world transformed by social media, surveillance, and new forms of resistance. The March on Washington was never meant to be the final chapter. It's a flashpoint, a mark on the ground saying this is who we are, and this is what we demand. It's a declaration, not a resolution. So the dream remains battered, challenged, reinterpreted, yet still alive. Whether it's delayed, distorted, or someday fulfilled doesn't depend on the past, but on us, on the choices we make, the injustices we confront, and the courage we muster to keep marching until the dream becomes a shared reality.